Hi, my name is Lara Loewenstein, and I'm a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Today, I'm presenting Disentangling Rent Index Differences, Data, Method, and Scope, which is joint work with Brian Adams and Hugh Montag of the BLS and Randal Verbrugge of the Cleveland Fed. Nothing I say today reflects the official positions of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland or the Federal Reserve System. The main question we ask in this paper is why have alternative rent index inflation measures differed so substantially from CPI tenant rent over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic? What we find is that scope accounts for the majority of the difference. CPI tenant rent measures the rent growth for all renters, while alternative measures focus solely on newly signed leases. Furthermore, we find that other differences, such as the representativity of the underlying data sample and the index construction methodology, matter relatively little for explaining these differences. The way we come to these conclusions is by using the BLS housing survey, which is the microdata that underlies the official CPI tenant rent index. We take these microdata and create two new repeat rent measures, an all tenant repeat rent index and a new tenant repeat rent index. The all tenant repeat rent index takes all repeat rent observations in the data, while the new repeat rent index limits the repeat rent observations to newly signed leases. We find that our all tenant repeat rent index tracks CPI tenant rent inflation relatively closely, while our new tenant repeat rent inflation measure tracks the alternative rent index measures. This implies that it is the scope of the data sample, specifically the limitation to newly signed leases, that explains the majority of the difference between official CPI rent inflation and alternative measures, while the index construction methodology, which the most common use by alternative measures is repeat rent indices, matters relatively little. Furthermore, we find that our new tenant repeat rent inflation leads official CPI tenant rent inflation by about 1 year. So over the course of the last 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic, alternative measures of rent inflation from sources such as Zillow, Apartment List, and CoreLogic have implied much higher rent inflation than official rent inflation statistics. Using the microdata underlying the official statistics, we can understand what is driving this difference. And by the construction of two new repeat rent indices, a new tenant repeat rent index and an all tenant repeat rent index, we can show that the majority of the difference is driven by the limitation of the alternative measures to newly signed leases. The CoreLogic single family rent index, which is based on rental listings on MLS, is especially close to our new tenant rent index, which is based on this BLS housing survey. Now, we do not take an exact stand on the implications for monetary policy, but given that our new tenant repeat rent index inflation leads official CPI tenant rent inflation, these findings may have implications for monetary policy.